In Bolivia, representatives of the Santa Cruz region have expressed their support for President Luis Arce in the midst of the right-wing attempts of destabilization. Several European nations have announced they will resume vaccinations with the AstraZeneca shots after the European Medicines Agency concluded that the vaccine was safe and effective. And Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has announced early parliamentary elections to be held on June 20th. Hello and welcome to TeleSUR English. I am Estefania Bravo from the headquarters of Quito in Ecuador. This is from the south. We start in Bolivia, where representatives of the Santa Cruz region have expressed their support for President Luis Arce in the midst of right-wing attempts at destabilization. Social movements in some 20 districts of the city of Santa Cruz have mobilized in face of the intentions of the far-right groups, such as the Civic Committee Pro Santa Cruz, which played a role in the 2019 coup to generate acts of destabilization. Meanwhile, social and indigenous organizations have condemned the interference of the Secretary General of the Organization of American States in the country's internal affairs, as judicial authorities seek to guarantee justice for the victims of the 2019 coup against President Evo Morales. This Thursday, representatives of the governments of Argentina and the United Kingdom signed an agreement requesting the International Committee of the Red Cross carry out further forensic work to identify the remains of Argentine soldiers killed during the Malvinas War. This agreement establishes a new humanitarian project plan, including the required legal framework and all technical details of the forensic efforts to exhume and identify human remains belonging to a number of individuals located within a mass grave in the island's Darwin Cemetery. The move, shortly before the 39th anniversary of the beginning of the war, it represents the continuity of Argentine state policy established by the national government in 2012 when it requested the collaboration of the International Red Cross Committee to make possible the identification of 122 Argentine soldiers buried at the cemetery. The Mexican government announced a plan to rescue the country's hydrocarbons industry this Thursday. The strategy will be outlined by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador in the southern state of Tabasco. The initiative is based on the discovery of an oil field in the region, which could provide 600 million barrels of oil per day. The government's proposal seeks to strengthen the Mexican sovereignty over its natural resources, as the energy reform promoted by former President Enrique Peña Nieto solely benefited the private sector by granting 107 oil production contracts. In Peru, hundreds of transporters blocked the main roads of the capital Lima and other cities as part of the national strike against the increase in fuel prices. In response to the failure of talks with the government, which lasted more than 10 hours, the sector union has extended the strike action, which has been ongoing for the past 4 days. President Francisco Sagasti stated that the strike must end to avoid affecting the transportation of medical supplies to fight the coronavirus pandemic. In addition to the rise in fuel prices, transporters are protesting an increase in toll rates as well as voicing other labor demands. In Colombia, another indigenous leader was assassinated on Wednesday, bringing the total number of murdered social leaders and human rights defenders so far this year to 34. Maria Bernanda Huajibioy, mayor of one of the 15 indigenous communities in the southwest department of Putumayo, was killed alongside her granddaughter. This incident occurred as she was traveling, accompanied by her daughter and granddaughters on a motorcycle in the municipality of Valle del Guamués. Huajibioy and her companions were intercepted by armed men who shot at the indigenous leader and her one-year-old granddaughter. Municipal authorities are inspecting the crime scene. The Caribbean island of Curacao saw its final election debate on Wednesday ahead of the general elections to be held on Friday, March 19th. The vote comes amid political tensions between the ruling coalition formed by the Real Alternative Party and the Man Party and two opposition parties. Polls conducted earlier this month show the current governing coalition is likely to lose seats and its right to form a government. Currently leading the polls are the center-right Movement for the Future of Curacao Party and the Christian Democratic National People's Party. However, a Kennedy Centrum Research Institute survey shows that 38% of voters are unwilling to reveal their intended candidate, leaving election day outcomes uncertain. This Thursday, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris swore in Deb Haaland as U.S. Secretary of the Interior. Haaland is the first Native American to become a cabinet secretary and will oversee a massive agency responsible for roughly 1/5 of land in the U.S., including its many Native American reservations. The Congresswoman was approved by the U.S. Senate by a vote of 51-40. Haaland, who hails from New Mexico's Laguna Pueblo tribe, already made history in 2018 when she became one of the first two Native American women elected to the U.S. Congress. We're taking our very first break now. Join us again after this, and also don't forget to follow me on my Twitter account at TeleSUR for more news. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. More news now. French Prime Minister Jean Castex announced massive new containment measures on Thursday to curb what he says is the appearance of a third wave of the COVID pandemic. The Prime Minister detailed that measures will be applied for 4 weeks from Saturday in 16 departments of the country. He also insisted that the restrictions will not be as strict as in the past. Non-essential businesses will close and movement outside will be restricted in the affected regions, but schools will stay open and outdoor exercises up to 10 kilometers from home will be allowed. And the French Prime Minister also explained that while nurseries and primary schools and colleges will open as normal, all high schools will switch to half capacity in the 16 departments affected by new restrictions. More than 2/3 of high schools will already operating at half capacity prior to the announcement of these new measures. And France will resume its COVID-19 vaccination program using the AstraZeneca shot from Friday after the European regulator concluded that the vaccine was safe and effective. Prime Minister Jean Castex himself will be vaccinated with the shot on Friday as a means to allay fears. The Spanish health minister announced that the country will resume the AstraZeneca vaccinations next Wednesday after Europe's medical regulators said the jab is, quote, safe and effective and not associated with a higher risk of blood clots.
The first consideration I would like to make, and that has been made by the EMA too, is that the AstraZeneca vaccine is a safe and effective vaccine. So I announced that we are restarting the AstraZeneca vaccination next week, on Wednesday to be precise.
German Health Minister Jens Spahn announced the country will resume vaccinations with AstraZeneca's COVID-19 jabs from Friday after the European Medicines Agency said the drug was safe and effective to use. The health minister took pains to justify this decision to suspend the use of the vaccine on Monday as the European regulator examined a handful of cases of thrombosis among people vaccinated with the AstraZeneca shot. Critics complained that the decision to halt of the use of the vaccine only suffered to fuel mistrust and further delay of Germany's already stuttering vaccination campaign. Brazil's new Minister of Health, Marcelo Queiroga, the country's fourth since the beginning of the pandemic, has said he will make possible adjustments to the policy of far-right President Jair Bolsonaro as the country's health crisis intensifies. The minister stated that the only way to reduce the death toll in the country is to improve hospital capacity and ensure social distancing to stop the virus from spreading. The situation worsened this year when several countries identified a more contagious strain of the virus named P1, which was first detected in Brazil. The country has begun vaccinating the over 75s and those at risk, but fears exist about the speed of the process and possible hesitation of the part of the population fueled by President's statements dismissing the use of the vaccines. We're taking our very first break now. Join us again after this. Welcome back to From the South. More news now. Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan announced early parliamentary elections on Thursday to be held on June 20th. The Prime Minister explained that this decision seeks to lift the country out of its current political crisis. Pashinyan had previously indicated that he was ready to call early elections amidst demands for his resignation from anti-government movements and some military sectors. The calls came following the Russian brokered deal with Azerbaijan to end the conflict with the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region, which some sectors of the country rejected. On Thursday, Lebanon's Prime Minister-designate Saad Hariri stressed the urgent need to form a government to relaunch talks with the International Monetary Fund to tackle the country's economic crisis. Beirut began talks with the IMF in May of last year, but they will soon hit a wall. The government of the time resigned after a massive explosion in Beirut port last August. In recent weeks, the Lebanese pound has continued to plummet to new lows against the dollar on the black market and has almost 90% of its value compared to a year and a half ago. The economic crisis has also been aggravated by the measures to contain the coronavirus pandemic. In Lebanon, the leader of the Hezbollah party, Hassan Nasrallah, has urged Prime Minister-designate Saad Hariri to abandon plans to form a government made up solely of technocrats and instead include political figures as well as the country's economic crisis deepens.
Lebanon is in the midst of a real, major national crisis. It is a financial, livelihood, and financial crisis. And it is also a political crisis. You can call it as well a system, government, present, past, and future crisis. We agree to form a government of specialists. I will not back down from something we've previously committed to. But this government won't be able to hear, will be incapable of saving the country, and won't take big, audacious, and courageous decisions.
Israel is among the main promoters of the terrorist war imposed on Syria. Damascus has stressed that over the last 10 years, Tel Aviv has not ceased to offer its support to extremist groups operating on Syrian soil, as well as launching airstrikes on the country. Our correspondent, Hisham Wanous, has the story.
In the last 2 years, Israel committed more than 200 airstrikes against Syria. The last one, which is the 7th of its kind so far this year, took place on Tuesday night, March 16th, with missiles launched from the occupied Syrian Golan against the southern perimeter of Damascus, and, like the previous attacks, it was countered by the air defense of the Syrian Arab Army. These are failed attempts to save the defeated terrorist gangs, which will be answered in due course, says the government and citizens of the Arab country.
Syria is ready to respond to any aggression, and the Syrian Arab Army is prepared to face Israeli aggression against Syrian territory as part of the war against terrorism and its sponsors, especially the Zionist entity, the main sponsor of terrorism in Syria.
Damascus denounces that the Israeli entity, since the beginning of the terrorist war in 2011, has supplied huge amounts of money, weapons, and ammunition to extremist groups that promote violent confrontation in Syria. This was confirmed when the Syrian army discovered several warehouses of Israeli-made weapons and food in the liberated areas in southern Syria, near the occupied Syrian Golan.
The Israeli aggressions take place in the context of continuous logistic support of Israeli entity to the terrorist groups operating in Syria to destabilize the whole region. There are intelligence reports that said that Israeli entity reactivated terrorist cells that attack positions of the Syrian Arab army in the southern region of Syria.
The Israeli entity employs all means to prevent the total defeat of the terrorists operating on Syrian soil. Besides the continuous bombing and the supply of weapons and ammunition, the Israeli occupation troops transfer wounded extremists to occupied Palestine for treatment and then return them to the battlefields in Syria. Hostile practices that Damascus claims will not prevent the inevitable victory of the Syrian Arab army against terrorism and its sponsors.
Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Thursday that his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden's remarks about him being a killer reflect the United States' own troubled past and current problems.
I remember when we were young and would bicker out in the yard, we would say, "I am rubber and you're glue. Bad names bounce off me and stick to you." This is not just a silly childish proverb. The meaning is psychological, quite deep. We always see our own qualities in other people and assume that they are just like us. The US think that we are the same as them, but we are different people. We have a different genetic code and cultural and moral values, but we know how to defend our interests. We work with them, but in those areas in which we are interested ourselves, and on terms that are beneficial for us, they will be forced to contend with this. They will be forced to contend with this despite all their efforts to stop our development, despite their sanctions and insults. They will be forced to contend with this on our part in accordance with our national interests. We will develop relations with all countries of the world, including the United States.
Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova stressed on Thursday that the U.S. had caused an impasse in the relations between Moscow and Washington.
In fact, our intention was to invite the ambassador of the Russian Federation in Washington for consultations with the Russian government departments on the state of bilateral relations between the United States and Russia. This is a step which can't be remembered by anybody over recent years and decades. There is unprecedented. The U.S. led to the impasse, not only relations with Russia, but I think their own ideology is an impasse. So what's next? They use the Russian factor as a holy grail, as a certain relic, mentioning all the time all that is linked to Moscow, to the Kremlin, to Russia. What is next?
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in Anchorage, Alaska on Thursday to meet with senior Chinese diplomats for the first face-to-face talks between the two powers. Tensions between Washington and Beijing remain high after relations were heavily damaged under the Donald Trump presidency, which saw a trade war and spats over everything from defense to technology and rights in the Chinese territory of Hong Kong. Blinken and White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan were set to talk with senior Chinese official Yang Jiechi and Foreign Minister Wang Yi on Thursday. Anchorage was considered a more neutral meeting ground than Washington or Beijing for the three-session summit that will conclude on Friday morning. Expectations for progress were reportedly limited on both sides. And U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan opened his remarks at the first face-to-face talks between U.S. and Chinese officials by stating that the Biden administration does not seek conflict with China but welcomes stiff competition. However, he also said that the new administration has deep concerns about Chinese actions in its autonomous regions of Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. China has repeatedly asked the U.S. to stop interfering in its internal affairs and spreading lies about events in these regions. The Republic of Congo is preparing for presidential elections to be held on Sunday, in which current President Denis Sassou Nguesso is seeking another term in office. At 77 years old, Nguesso has ruled the Central African nation for 36 years. He faces 7 other presidential hopefuls, but is expected to secure another term. If no candidate obtains an absolute majority of valid votes, the 2 candidates with the highest number of votes will go to a second round election 21 days after the results are announced by the Constitutional Court. And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief, but remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, don't forget to follow us on our social media accounts. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram as well. For TeleSUR English, I am Estefania Bravo. See you next time.